Ladies and gentlemen, the State of Israel has been blessed and is blessed to have Ron Dermer as the ambassador of the State of Israel to the United States of America. There is no one who has served the Prime Minister of the State of Israel with greater trust, greater confidence, greater vision, greater passion, and a greater commitment to Israel, to the Jewish people, to the Zionist world, and to the United States. Ron Dermer serves with great dignity, great respect here in Washington, D.C., having been sent here by Prime Minister Netanyahu, and we are honored and privileged to have him with us tonight to address from Balfour to statehood. Mr. Ambassador.
I got to say, Richard, I'm going to subcontract you hosting all of my events here, because I've been here for 4 years and this place has never rocked like this before. So kudos to you all for coming, and also for Richard for his leadership and for really his unabashed Zionism, unequivocal and unabashed Zionism. And who knows, Richard, if you keep at it, you just might end up being the most Zionist member of the Heidemann family. But I want to thank Richard, Phyllis, and Alana for all that they do for the Jewish people and the Jewish state. So please join me in thanking them. I want to welcome our ministers, our members of Knesset. I want to welcome Baroness Deitch. We have been blessed, the Jewish people have been blessed by some of the greatest philo-Semites that have come actually from Britain. Lord Shaftesbury, a famous one, Lord Balfour, Winston Churchill, of course, George Eliot, and Colonel Richard Kent. He always gets nervous when I have a microphone. He never knows what I'm going to say. But he stood up for Israel when no one else was standing up and was part of this great tradition of Friends of Israel. And all he's gotten for his troubles is a lifetime of salmon dinners and attending Jewish events throughout the world. So I want to thank you for that. And I especially want to welcome the Mengistu family who are here tonight. As you heard from Richard, they are in D.C. to raise awareness of the plight of a son, of a brother, Avraham Avera. He's been held by Hamas for 3 years, and I hope everyone here, each in their own way with the organizations that they run, will help us raise awareness about their brother and their son's plight, and do all you can to help this person who is being held against his will, and that Israel is committed to his safe return. But thank you for being here tonight. Can you hear me in the back of the room, by the way? Yes? You can hear me? Because I can hear you. I'm going to speak tomorrow, and I know that you've heard a lot of speeches today, and you're going to hear a few more speeches after me. But Richard asked me to say a few words anyway, so I will try to be brief. The topic that he told me about, you just heard, he said, we'll speak about from Balfour to statehood. And I thought that I'd share 3 thoughts about that with all of you. My first thought is this 30-year period between 1917, the Balfour Declaration, and May 1948, when we actually established, when Ben-Gurion declared statehood, is probably the most significant period in Jewish history since the days of the Bible. And there have been a lot of significant periods. And it's significant for good and significant for evil. In hindsight, it's obvious that the train of destruction was leaving the station, and that the train of redemption was coming into the station. But in real time, on the eve of Balfour, few saw either. In November 1917, few saw either. Very few Jews understood that a Holocaust, or anything close to a Holocaust, was coming around the corner. Herzl, by the way, was one of the few who actually understood the dangers that were facing the Jewish people. He saw the anti-Semitic venom that could poison a civilized society in the Dreyfus trial. And he wrote, actually, of the coming conflagration, the fire that could consume the Jews of Europe. And he did everything he could in this short, marvelous period of his life to secure the future for the Jewish people. But most people were completely blind to the dangers. Now, as for Zionism, few Jews were believers. We forget that. We talk about 2 million people and all the organizations here. In 1917, most people thought that Zionism was an absurd idea. And many Jews said, and wrote, that it was going to undermine their status in their own countries. And Balfour definitely did galvanize Zionism. There's no question about that. You can see it in the numbers. In America in 1914, there were a total of 7,500 members of Zionist organizations in the United States. 1914. By 1919, a little more than a year after the Balfour Declaration, there were 150,000. Talk about 2 million today, but 150,000. But that was still a very small share of the Jewish people. And there were many, many opponents of Zionism among Jews. Actually, some of the fiercest opponents were among Jews. And opposition that today looks sort of embarrassing. But at the time, people went to the barricades and were opposing Zionism. In fact, they established in Britain, I'm sure the Baroness knows this, an organization almost immediately after the Balfour Declaration of Jews to oppose the Balfour Declaration, I think within a few days. So the first lesson for me is how easy it is to be blind to truly historical events in real time. A second thought is that this 30-year period exposes the absurdity of the lie that Israel was created because of the Holocaust. 25 years before the final solution was decided at Wannsee, 25 years before, Balfour signed this declaration. And the Balfour Declaration, as many of you know, and I'm sure you heard today, was roundly supported. In fact, it was a matter of consensus of the great powers of the time. And it was then, in short order, passed by the League of Nations, who charged Britain with fulfilling, in its mandate, fulfilling the promise of the Balfour Declaration. But as I said last week at the British Embassy, this idea that about the Holocaust and Israel, and the Holocaust being the reason why there's a state of Israel, is not just absurd, it's obscene. It's obscene. Because it is not that there is an Israel because of the Holocaust, it's that there was a Holocaust because there was no Israel. There was no refuge. There was no refuge for the Jews. The gates of countries were shut, including this country. And the shores of our own homeland were blocked at the time. And the sad truth is that the promise of Balfour was too late for millions who could have been saved. At Versailles, the Jews should have gotten a state. I don't know if you had a session on that today. But unlike the Palestinians and many of the Arabs, the Jews actually supported the Allies. Everyone that's running around asking the British to apologize for the Balfour Declaration should ask those who are asking, are you going to apologize for being on the wrong side of not just World War I, of World War II, of the Cold War, of the Gulf War, you name it, they've always been on the wrong side. So here you had all of Britain's opponents. Many of them got huge swaths of territory, and we left Versailles, the Jewish people left Versailles, with a promise that took 3 decades to materialize. That's why the greatest diplomatic failure in the history of the Jewish people was the failure to get a state at that critical hour. About 10 years ago, the Prime Minister's father, he published a book which I highly recommend everyone read called The Five Founding Fathers of Zionism. And he had an event, he was about 97 years old at the time, and he spoke about Versailles and what had happened. And he recalled this episode of Israel Zangwill, another great British playwright who was a real Zionist and an acolyte of Herzl. He writes to Chaim Weizmann, who did a lot to secure the Balfour Declaration, but he writes him quite upset that after Versailles the Jews didn't get a state. And he explains everything that I said about us being on the right side, them being on the wrong side. How did they get all this territory, and how did we get nothing? Nothing. And he asked Weizmann, why did you not demand the state? And Weizmann's reply was that he didn't demand the state because the British weren't going to give it to him. And Zangwill sent him a short note saying, and you thought you'd get it by not asking for it? It's funny, but it's sad. And it's the second lesson, and that, for me at least, is how important it is to be ready for these great historical moments. Seizing those moments could require decades of work, but it will also require bold action at a critical time. That's the second lesson. The third thought is that Balfour should remind us of how much the Holocaust has distorted the Jewish people's view of our own history. Forget about the world for a second. Certainly distorted the world's view of Jewish history, but it distorted the Jews' view of our own history because it is so traumatic an event that it was like a sun that blocked out all the anti-Semitic stars in the sky. And people think, well, there was no anti-Semitism, or they tend to believe there's almost no anti-Semitism before the Holocaust. There was this seismic event that happened, and as long as there's no Nazis, there's no anti-Semitism. When the truth is very different. The truth is that century after century, the Jews were subject to just about every evil under the sun. Persecution, massacres, expulsion, and of course, the worst tragedy of them all, the Holocaust. And I remember a couple of years ago, the Prime Minister of France, after that attack in Paris, who was a friend of Israel, and he came out and he said how important it was that the Jews will be in France, because France would not be France without the Jews. And he said, we're not Spain. We didn't expel the Jews. Now, it used to be in antiquity that if you were going to be a scholar, you had to sit in a library in Alexandria for like decades and read all these scrolls. Right now, all you have to do is Google it. And this is a problem for staff, by the way. And when your prime minister is saying something that is patently untrue, you should kind of check that. The Jews were expelled from France, and the Prime Minister of France didn't even know it. And the Jews were not expelled once or twice, they were expelled 3 times. And they were expelled from England, which a lot of people don't know. And they were certainly expelled from Spain, but they were expelled in many other places. And you think about how almost everything that happened before the Holocaust is blocked out. The best example for me was actually a story my mother told me. My mother was born in Free State Israel in Gedera. And when she was 3 or 4 years old, this is before the Holocaust and the final solution and all the reports came. And when she was 3 or 4 years old, when her mother would scare her, try to tell her to go to bed or else the boogeyman will come, who would the boogeyman be? Khmelnytsky. Raise your hand if you know who Khmelnytsky was. Wow, this is a good crowd. Because if I ask most crowds, I'm lucky to get 2 hands. We got about 20 here, which is pretty impressive. Khmelnytsky was a Ukrainian Cossack who killed, scholars debate this. Was it 150,000 Jews? Was it 300,000 Jews? It's an event that's like lost from Jewish history, because Hitler is the sun that blocks out everything that comes before. But the truth is, when the Balfour Declaration was made in 1917, a quarter century before the Holocaust, anti-Semitism was certainly on everybody's mind. Everybody's mind. And when Herzl founded the World Zionist Congress 120 years ago, anti-Semitism was certainly on his mind. But when it came to anti-Semitism, Herzl recognized the danger, but he did not understand the cause of the hatred. He and others, many of the Zionist leaders, believed that the reason why the Jews were hated is because they were minorities everywhere and a majority nowhere. And they thought that if they normalized the condition of the Jews, if the Jews would have a state, then they would be treated like all the other nations of the world. Would be like Italians or Englishmen or anything else, and that the hatred would somehow wither away. And the irony is that this view that's mistaken has actually come full circle. The beginning of the 20th century, in this age of Balfour, and those first 2 decades, many of the leading Zionists believed that the reason why there was anti-Semitism is because the Jews had no state. Today, many people believe that the reason why there's anti-Semitism is that the Jews have a state. Then they were saying, the enemies of the Jewish people, Jews go to Palestine. Now the enemies of the Jewish people say Jews get out of Palestine. And the truth is that Zionism, and Israel, I should say, is not the cause or the cure for anti-Semitism. But the big change that happened on this path from Balfour to statehood, the big change that happened with the restoration of Jewish sovereignty and the rebirth of the Jewish state, is not that the hatred ended, but that the Jewish people now had the power to respond to that hatred. That is the change that happened with the birth of Israel. We can be soldiers on the battlefield. We can be lawyers in the courtroom. We can be scholars in universities fighting this fight. We can even be ambassadors who have the privilege to walk in the halls of government or get mic'd up in a television studio. You see, by putting us, the Jewish people, on a path to statehood, Balfour helped transport us from being spectators to history to actors in history. And that is why the third and most important lesson of Balfour is that it is much better to be an actor than to be a spectator. So I applaud the American Zionist movement for being actors, for being in the arena, for recognizing the dangers in real time when many others would rather bury their head in the sand, and for being ready to seize the moments that will surely come. Have a wonderful evening.